Hello, and welcome to TOPS, the Tobacco Online Policy Seminar. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Sam Sturm, a PhD candidate at Georgia State University. TOPS is organized by Mike Pesco at University of Missouri, C. Shang at The Ohio State University, Michael Darden at Johns Hopkins University, Jamie Hartman-Boyce at University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Justin White at Boston University. The seminar today will be 1 hour with questions from the moderator and discussant. The audience may pose questions and comments in the Q&A panel, and the moderator will draw from these questions and comments in conversation with the presenter. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable questions. Please keep the questions professional and related to the research being discussed. Questions that meet the seminar series guidelines will be shared with the presenter afterwards, even if they are not read aloud. Your questions are very much appreciated. The presentation is going to be video recorded and will be made available along with presentation slides on the TOPS website, tobaccopolicy.org. I will now turn the presentation over to today's moderator, Michael Darden from Johns Hopkins University, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Sam. So today we continue our winter 2025 season with a single paper presentation by Colin Reinhardt entitled Flavorants and Addiction, an Empirical Analysis of Cigarette Bans and Taxation. The presentation was selected via competitive review process by submission through the TOPS website. Colin M. Reinhardt is a financial economist in the Retail Credit Risk Analysis Division within the Supervision Risk and Analysis at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. His research interests lie in applied industrial organization and consumer demand modeling, with a particular focus on the effects of government policy on consumer and firm behavior. He joined the OCC in 2024 and holds a PhD in economics from the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Reinhardt, thank you for presenting for us today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to present. This research is very dear to my heart. It is the work that I left UCI presenting and sort of culminates the capstone of my research. So let me go ahead and share this piece. Now, before I begin, I do have to start with several comments. First and foremost, I'm a member of the federal government. This requires me to be very clear that the opinions in this piece is those of myself and Jawei, and that the views expressed in this presentation do not represent the views of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Department of the Treasury, or the United States government. I think it's kind of clear that the Department of the Treasury, at least, is not interested in tobacco legislation. Now, I also want to say that I, by trade, am an IO economist. I study consumer and firm behavior. I'm entering y'all's space as tobacco policy researchers with this work, and I think there is this very interesting application of traditional IO techniques to these policy questions that you see in regulatory spaces. However, as an IO economist, I understand that a lot of these models come with a huge amount of overhead, especially when it comes to developing and writing and coding. We just don't have a standardized application in IO. To that end, it is extremely important that IO economists share code with each other. So if anyone is interested in or has questions about the code in this research, please reach out to me. I am more than happy to share all the MATLAB code that I wrote for this, everything, as so many IO researchers have, everything sort of handwritten. And it's the only way we can learn and develop better models. Cool. Let me go ahead and jump into the other disclosures I have to make. First and foremost, there was no funding received for this in any way. Jawei and I have also not received funding from tobacco companies, pharmaceutical companies, advocacy groups, consulting firms, etc. And that the analyses within this research are based on data collected from Nielsen. However, the conclusions drawn are those of Jawei and I and do not reflect the views of Nielsen or the Kilt Center of Marketing. Now, the goal of this work was to determine the impact of the proposed menthol ban. I don't know if y'all have seen but the menthol ban was withdrawn. The proposal was withdrawn about 3 hours ago. So this has turned from a what could happen to a what would have happened scenario. Um, and I don't know if it's really particularly important for me to explain why this ban is important, why cigarette smoking is so harmful. Y'all are tobacco industry researchers. I think that's quite clear. Um, Within this, though, when I first went into this project as a layperson who had very little knowledge of the tobacco industry, I did not know the overwhelming preference the Black American community held for menthol products. That Black Americans, when they make a choice of cigarette, they choose menthol cigarettes somewhere in the range of 75 to 90% of the time. And then looking into this, it seemed to be connected to historical marketing practices that were pushed onto the Black American community in the 1950s and 1960s. Obviously, the FDA wanted to save lives when they proposed this ban, but they also wanted to advance health equity within the Black American community. So in my own research, it is particularly important for me to determine how the menthol ban could have reduced smoking, but also reduced smoking among marginalized communities. And then I did want to acknowledge that we've seen sort of murmurings in the past of the FDA looking at banning additional flavor products, flavorant products such as like flavored e-cigarettes, as flavored e-cigarettes are still largely available um, across most states in their disposable form. Although I think there's been some pushback on the cartridge-based flavored e-cigarettes. So with this in mind, there were several research questions that I had when I entered this project. First foremost, how does banning menthol cigarettes impact smoking rates? How about smoking rates within marginalized communities? And do consumers switch to alternative products like e-cigarettes, like smoking cessation products? And then I wanted to ask the question, can taxation be as effective in reducing overall smoking? What tax rate results in the same reduction in smoking as that seen under the menthol ban? And then how does consumer surplus compare to the ban as opposed to the tax policy? Would people prefer to be banned or the menthol cigarettes to be banned, or would they prefer to be taxed instead? Then I wanted to ask the question, what if the FDA expands the menthol ban to encompass flavored varieties of e-cigarettes, menthol and flavored e-cigarettes? What would happen to overall e-cigarette smoking rates? And as a teaser to my final results, I find that the menthol ban reduces cigarette smoking by about 13%, but about 35% in the Black American community, which is huge for advocates who want to advance health equity within these marginalized communities. And that consumers, they really don't switch to alternative products like e-cigarettes as a function of the menthol ban. Can taxation be as effective? The answer is yes. And $1.02 tax rate on all cigarettes results in an equivalent reduction in overall smoking, and that consumers would prefer to be taxed rather than have menthol products banned. However, that only is the case if you consider Black American consumers within the overall group of consumers who are having their surplus reduced. If you remove Black Americans, non-Black Americans would much prefer the tax policy. Much prefer the ban as opposed to the tax policy, likely going into their differential smoking rates, right? Non-Black consumers smoke menthol products maybe 30% of the time. And then if the FDA expands the menthol ban to encompass flavored and menthol varieties of e-cigarettes, I find that e-cigarettes have about a 46% reduction in consumption. In approaching these research questions, I take the traditional IO approach. I design a model of consumer demand and firm supply. My demand model is an extension of the traditional demand model we use in industrial organization research. I use the random coefficient nested logit model with Nielsen data from 2015 through July of 2019. In this, I incorporate both retail data and household data. Retail data is great. It provides a very good understanding of how consumption changes as a function of, say, changes in price. On the flip side, household data provides a much better estimation of how, say, addiction plays a role in continued consumption, how past consumption influences future consumption. In that, I allow addiction to exist within my model as a form of dynamic state-dependent behavior. Whatever you chose in the past will influence what you choose in the future. I allow for, for those familiar with logistic modeling techniques, I'm using the nested logit variation of this random coefficient model. This allows for particular rates of substitution between certain products. So I have categories that would be cigarettes, e-cigarettes, and smoking cessation products. And then within those categories, people are able to substitute between their products of interest at a particular rate. So people would substitute between menthol and, say, traditional tobacco cigarettes at a certain rate, as well as menthol, tobacco, and flavored varieties of e-cigarettes. And that rate is determined by these nesting parameters. And finally, to capture things like Black American preference for menthol products, I allow for demographic interactions with the demand parameters in my model. That's the demand side. Once I've estimated that, I can turn to the supply side. I have a supply side model that incorporates the dynamic state-dependent behavior. So my firms in the supply side are pricing today, knowing that they're going to influence future demand for their product via this dynamic state dependency that exists on the demand side. And I think that's very realistic in how tobacco companies have priced, and knowing that their products are addictive, and that the change in demand today will influence the change in the demand for the future. And then once I've defined my supply side, I can move into my counterfactual simulations. And in that, I also consider merged producers and independent producers, as tobacco companies are increasingly purchasing and creating their own e-cigarette firms to sort of capture this new market. Now, as I jump into the model, I first need to discuss the data I have available to me. My primary sources of data are the Nielsen retail and Nielsen household data. I have retail data and household data through July or through 2015 through July of 2019. In this, I form my markets of interest at the DMA week level. So the DMA is a designated marketing area defined by Nielsen. It is a group of counties which are similar in characteristics. So Nielsen defines DMAs. It's proprietary to Nielsen, but I think there's about 206 in the United States, and I use the 100 largest in my model estimation. It accounts for somewhere in the range of 85% of the US, 85% of all the stores in my sample, 85% of all the households in my sample, 85% of the US population. So my research does account for a very large proportion of the United States. And then when looking at census data, there's no discernible difference in the distribution of consumers outside of my model as opposed to consumers within my model. And then I obtain, speaking of distribution of consumers, I obtain information at the DMA level related to racial and income statistics from the American Community Survey 5-year estimates, so the Census Bureau. On the household data, I have about 14,000 households who purchased my products of interest over these 4.5 years. They make quite a few purchases, and I classify each household by their racial and their income status, as that data is available in Nielsen as well. Now, I have an absurd amount of sales information. I need to simplify. These demand models are very computationally intensive, and I just can't have that many products in my model. So what I do is I aggregate my products, my sales, to the category flavor level. So I have 6 products I consider in my model that fall into 3 categories, and those categories are the nests at which consumers can substitute between them. So I have cessation products, that would be your nicotine lozenges, your nicotine patches, your Nicorette, your gums. Then I have cigarettes, and within cigarettes, you have a choice of regular tobacco cigarettes or menthol cigarettes. And then I have e-cigarettes, which contain a choice of regular tobacco e-cigarettes, menthol e-cigarettes, or flavored e-cigarettes. Finally, I have sales of these products at the DMA week level. I convert quantity sales to smoking rates by dividing the total sales by the population of the designated marking area, and then adjusting that population such that smoking rates formed within my data best fit smoking rates observed from the what is it, county level health rankings.org or countyhealthrankings.org provides county level estimates of smoking rates, which I can then aggregate up to the DMA level. Now, I think this is a good place to have my first round of questions because, after this, I'm going to jump into the model itself.
That's great, Colin. Thank you so much. So let me introduce our discussant today. It's going to be Dr. Travis Whittaker, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Yale University School of Public Health and is a Castor postdoctoral research fellow. So Dr. Whittaker, take it away, please.
Hi. Yeah. Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to present this today. I had some time to read through the paper this week, and it's very well done. So I was able to learn a lot. I guess for this right now, I have two questions, and then we can get to some other questions later. One, I think in your paper, you mentioned one of the concerns from like some of the groups of like the FDA enforcing a menthol ban was like potential like discriminatory practices by law enforcement and things like that. So do you know like any of the details like about um how enforcement of the policy, I guess, was supposed to work? I guess now that it's not gonna happen.
I unfortunately don't.
Okay.
I did interview with the FDA at one point in time, and they discussed it. I don't think that's something they could also, talk to. I think that would be up to local communities to enforce the policy. And, to be frank, there is a whole lot localized enforcement does not seem to work, right? I live in Manhattan, and there's that, what is it, the e-cigarette, the ban on flavored e-cigarettes, and I mean, they're still available you still see them in every store, all the flavored varieties, regardless as to whether or not they're banned. So
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. And then the other question, I guess, more on your data was, I guess for the how you have the Nielsen household data.
Mhm.
So do you know like who is it? Just you just know that the household is purchasing, or do you know like individuals in the household are purchasing?
Question. I only know that the household is purchasing. And I have to make that assumption that if a household is purchasing, that household is a smoking household. Now, generally, I don't see households purchase both menthol and tobacco or both menthol and e-cigarettes. They seem to switch if they're going to, transition their behavior, which is good. So I think, if a household smokes cigarettes, they're going to stick to maybe their cigarette of choice.
I see. Yeah. And so then I guess with that, you can't really do any differentials by like age or some things like that since it's the household, right?
And Nielsen itself is somewhat restricted. I mean, the Nielsen data, the youngest households tend to be in their early 20s, and then, but the majority tend to be mid 30s to, late 50s. So that is also one of the restrictions in this model, that I just don't have the ability to differentiate consumers based on age. And that is a potential source of bias, which is why it's important that I also have a secondary source of data, the retail data, which hopefully, the combination of these two sources will help reduce the biases prevalent in both.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. That's it for right now, from me.
What about the Q&A questions?
Yeah, thanks. I'm looking at the Q&A questions, and many of them have to do with the model itself. So I think we should probably move to the model and then take more time for the second Q&A.
Of course. So with the model itself, I follow what is the traditional assumptions in IO. We're trying to determine every week what a consumer is going to do by analyzing their underlying utility that they receive from consumption. If we assume that a consumer receives no utility or a utility normalized to zero of not consuming any product, of not smoking, then what we do is we measure the utility of all other choices relative to that choice. And then the consumer will choose whatever gives them the highest amount of happiness, the highest amount of utility. So again, the utility from consuming nothing is normalized to zero, and then the utility from consuming a specific choice, where that choice is a member of a specific category, is as follows. And this is really, excluding this portion here, this is really the standard setup in traditional industrial organization models. You have consumer utility as a function of product characteristics, as a function of price, and those product characteristic parameters and the price parameters are individual specific. So they can be broken down into a mean component, a demographic component, and a random individual specific component, where that random component follows a normal distribution. So you can imagine beta I here is actually beta plus some demographic specific parameter plus some random individual specific parameter. And then we have, in my model, which sort of differentiates it from most other demand models, and that is this dynamic state dependent behavior. What you consumed in the past influences your consumption today. So this first portion says, did you consume any nicotine containing product? Did you consume an e-cigarette? Did you consume a cigarette? Did you consume a cessation product last week? If you did, then it's going to increase your, well, potentially increase your propensity to consume again this week, right? This is an estimatable parameter, so I don't want to place, structure on it. But yes, it does increase your propensity to consume again this week, is what I find. And then the second portion says, well, not only is your utility for consumption going to be increased if you consumed a nicotine product last week, but your utility should also increase specifically at the category level. That is, if you consumed a cigarette last week, you should be more likely to consume, or you could be more likely to consume a cigarette again this week, right? Addiction is physiological, addiction is psychological. You have physical addiction to nicotine products. You want that nicotine, but you also have that psychological addiction. People who smoke cigarettes want to continue to smoke cigarettes. People who smoke e-cigarettes want to continue to smoke e-cigarettes. And this captures that psychological component of addiction. And then finally, we have market time, product specific demand shocks, and we have this unobserved individual preference for products that is distributed under the distributional assumptions of a two-level nested logit model. So this contains that rate of substitution between products which fall within the same category. Now, it is very important within industrial organization that we're able to break up these individual parameters into a mean component, a demographic specific component, and a random component. Doing so allows us to decompose our indirect utility function into a product specific part that is the same across all individuals, and an individual specific part where this product specific part contains the mean utility, and then everything individual specific, demographic specific is contained within this component here. And then of course you also have your nesting parameters in the error term. This is quite nice because it means that with simply a guess of the parameter values of theta, all the individual specific parameters, and a guess of the mean utilities of consuming a particular product in a particular market and a time, we can evaluate a household log likelihood function just by integrating out those unobserved preferences. It's simple, it's easy. A two-level nested logit model has a form that has a actual mathematical form, so you don't need to do any Monte Carlo integration, and then the random components of the preference parameters do have they're distributed normally, so you do have to do some Monte Carlo integration over that, but that's not too difficult. Anyways, that's easy. And then with those same guesses, you can also simulate retail market shares. what I do is I draw 200 consumers per market. Each consumer is a particular type, so they're random draws from the demographic distributions in a market and the preference distribution in a market, and then I iterate those consumers over time. So I simulate their consumption over time to back out how changes in price, for instance, could change specific consumers' consumption, conditional on their state-dependent behavior. This is quite nice. Now, the downside is that theta contains maybe 20 individual specific parameters. Delta here is a parameter value for every product in every market in every time period in my model. There's about 135,000 parameters in delta. There is no way you could estimate a household level log likelihood function with 135,000 plus parameters. It would take light years for that to happen. So I use the findings of Berry, Levinson, and Pakes 1995 paper, which says that for any guess of theta, there has to exist a unique vector of mean utilities where the simulated market shares exactly equal the shares observed in my model. So I can use the market simulation to back out the parameter values of delta and then do a search function over theta to maximize the household log likelihood function, because the household log likelihood function now becomes a function purely of theta. That's very helpful. And it makes my estimation actually, reasonable. So I have 15,000 or so households with, they have little over 2 million weekly observations. I search over, I find the values of theta, which maximize the household level log likelihood function. And then I use the sandwich estimator of covariance to account for any model misspecification. Once I have backed out the individual parameters, which maximize the individual, the household log likelihood function, I can then go back and take regression of the mean utility on my parameters of interest to obtain, say, the mean utility changes as a result of changes in price, or the average preference for cigarettes among the population. And then I also, doing that, I have to bootstrap my standard errors using a sort of traditional bootstrap routine. Okay, that is the model estimation. Let's turn to the demand estimates. There are a whole lot of values here. I'm not going to go through each of them. I think there's only a few I need to highlight. First and foremost, price is negative and statistically significant. That is exactly what we would want to see. I find that low-income consumers have an increased preference for cigarettes. That makes sense given historical preferences. I find that Black American consumers have an extreme increased preference for menthol products. Again, that makes sense given their historical consumption. I find that looking at the preference parameters, or the individual specific parameters, past consumption influences current product choice. However, past consumption influencing current product choice is strongest at the categorical level. That is, you're willing to consume products because of past consumption, but you're much more likely to continue to consume what you consumed last week. And I want to be clear here with my state-dependent parameters that I am hopefully capturing addiction in this, but I'm capturing anything else that goes into continued consumption of cigarette products. Because I can't, parse out the addictive component of cigarettes from things like habit formation. And that might be why, for instance, this e-cigarette state-dependent behavior is significantly larger than any other state-dependent behaviors in the model, that there might be some consumer learning behavior that is going on in the 2015, the 2016, 2017, where consumers try e-cigarettes. They're like, oh, this is great, and they continue to use them. Whereas cigarettes and cessation products, generally, people have formed an opinion about those in the past. So I want to be clear, I'm hopefully capturing addiction, but I'm capturing anything else that goes into continued usage. And then finally, I have my nesting parameters. My nesting parameters suggest that there is a high level of substitution among e-cigarettes and a lower level of substitution, a high level of substitution among flavored tobacco and menthol varieties of cigarettes, and a lower level of substitution among the category of e-cigarettes. That is, people are more likely to switch between cigarettes than they are to switch between e-cigarettes. And that makes sense. I don't see, people who smoke like mango flavored e-cigarettes switching over to tobacco e-cigarettes. And then finally, in the model, I have my supply side. It's a simple supply side model where I have differentiated firms who are interested in maximizing their profits. They encompass that state-dependent behavior that exists on the demand side. This does bias my model. When firms decide the prices they're going to set today, they look towards the future. Obviously, firms at the tail end of my sampling period should be looking beyond the end of my sampling period, but I just don't have any data beyond that. So that biases the final quarters of my data, and or the final several weeks of my data. So I just toss out the final quarter of my analysis. I find that firms really don't look more than about 2 months in the future when they're making decisions today. And then finally, I consider 2 versions of my supply side model. I have independent producers of cigarettes and e-cigarettes and merged producers of e-cigarettes and cigarettes to sort of act as bounds on possible firm responses when we look at how they change their prices in the model. Now, that was a whole lot of information. I think this is a good spot before I jump into my counterfactuals to allow for questions related to my model.
Dr. Whitaker, I will let you start with any questions about the model.
Yes. So I think one of my just clarifying question on I think the model when it comes to like the purchase quantity, I think you have a robustness check portion of this in your paper. But would you be able to explain kind of like an issue with like stockpiling cigarettes and if this creates a problem in the model for you?
That could create a problem. I did look at stockpiling behavior. I looked at consumption or purchase behavior after a, say, price decrease. And looking and seeing if it took people who, after a price decrease, if it took consumers in the household level data longer to purchase again. And I did not find significant results in that, suggesting that cigarette consumptions might be one of those things people just do habitually rather than. Now, that's not to say that there aren't, that doesn't happen. It likely does happen, but not enough to, I think, sway the results of my model.
I guess my second question, which is also kind of related to that, is then not necessarily also about the stockpiling, but if different kinds of consumers might purchase different quantities at like different frequencies, is that something that you were able to account for? Do you think
the model itself doesn't really look at frequencies? I would capture, say, frequency if consumers, certain types of consumers are just more likely to purchase. I have that demographic specific component which captures, say, demographic preference for products. Obviously, you find low income consumers are more likely to purchase. And I also have a random component. So I assume that across a population, there's a normal distribution, sort of a normal distribution of preferences for cigarettes. So you have people who are much more likely to buy cigarettes and you have people much less likely, but I'm not capturing any. And I do want to be clear here as we move into the counterfactuals, particularly the taxation counterfactual. I don't account for how taxation could reduce the quantity sales. I'm just trying to look at whether or not people are going to buy cigarettes in this.
Okay, I think if we can move to the audience Q&A questions.
Great. Yeah. I mean, so the first question that came up was just about black market substitution.
Of course.
Yeah. And so I don't think that's a part of the model, but can you maybe talk about how that not being in the model would affect things?
I mean, this is probably the when I was doing this, one of the biggest areas or biggest issues that I identified was the fact that you do have black market sales. So I back out my model estimates from observed retail sales, obviously legal sales. My estimates first on the demand side and supply side, my estimates are, I think, robust, will be robust so long as legal sales can act as a proxy for illegal sales. That is, as long as they trend similarly. That seems to be the case. Looking at most sources of data, there seems to be, people reduce their illegal sales of cigarettes at least over time, similar to the reduction in um, illegal sales. Legal and illegal seem to trend similarly. Moving into the counterfactuals, it could be an issue if, say, you then have smuggling operations which bring, say, menthol products in the country, or you have smuggling operations which try to avoid the taxation policy. But I do want to say that a overarching menthol ban was put into place in Canada and most Canadian states, and there has been no research to suggest that there's been an increase in the illegal sales of menthol products as compared to prior to the ban's enforcement. In fact, there's research that suggests there hasn't been an increase in illegal sales of menthol products. And second, the presence of profit maximizing smugglers implies that an overarching taxation policy applied to cigarettes means that there will be some pass-through rate of that tax policy onto consumers within the legal market. These are smugglers who want to make money. If the prices of cigarettes rise everywhere, they can also raise their prices to make an easier buck. So that even if there was a national tax policy, as I propose in this model, I suspect the illegal market would face a similar tax as the legal market.
Great. So one other question that's just kind of a methodological question that I think might be very educational for everyone, for me as well. So if I understand correctly, you've got this nested logit model that you're going to estimate on data in a world where menthol cigarettes are being sold, and you're going to get some substitution patterns that are going to help you think about, in a counterfactual world where we ban menthol cigarettes, what are people going to do? And so, there are other models out there that have looked at this question, like David Levy's work, which I think you cite, which has kind of some decision rules that are kind of baked in based on past substitution patterns. So I think it would just be educational for me and for the audience to kind of know, how is this model, this economic model, different when you take the next step to simulate the effect of a ban from maybe his model or existing models that are out there.
So within the literature, I'm following what would be sort of standard in industrial organization. You take, so it is a logit model, but it's also a nested logit model, but it's also a random coefficient model. So you have not only the willingness to substitute among products within within the same category, but you also have a distributional assumption applied to that. If I go back a couple slides, you'll see that I have these standard deviations of product preference, suggesting that in the market you have rates of substitution of people who are consuming the product, as well as a distributional assumption applied to how people are willing to consume the product. So that, I think, is one of the first steps that that takes my model away from more traditional models. And second, a lot of the more traditional models I've seen in this space rely on nested logits applied to solely one source of data. I'm working with household and retail data, and I'm simulating an overall market rather than looking at, say, a sample of specific consumers. And this helps, as we discussed earlier, fix the issues that are prevalent in most models that rely solely on household data. You don't observe to the best level of accuracy how consumers change their consumption with a function as a result of, say, changes in price. It is very difficult to estimate without sort of aggregate level information how changes in demand demand change as a function of price. In addition, how firms, of course, the supply side added to this, how firms will respond to the change, the reduction in consumption that you see on the demand side if you do, in fact, put something like this into place. And finally, sort of differentiating my work from any other work, excluding Sarah Tuckman, who I think is at the University of Chicago right now, or maybe Kellogg Booth School of Marketing. She has a demand model that encompasses this dynamic state-dependent behavior, as do I. So I think it is similar in that I'm using sort of the base model structure, but I'm adding more bells and whistles, so to say, that allow me to analyze consumer and market behavior, sort of this equilibrium consumption over time.
Okay, great. I just want to make one quick announcement. So in the Q&A, please keep the questions coming. If we don't have time to get to them, or you'd like to discuss with the speaker directly, you're welcome to attend Top of the Tops immediately following this webinar. The URL will be posted in the chat, and so you can join immediately after we're done here. So in the interest of time, why don't you show us the counterfactuals?
Yep, and this shouldn't take too much time. There's only 3 major counterfactuals. First, and most obviously, what happens if we ban menthol cigarettes, and referencing papers that have looked at this, but from alternative perspectives, Levy and Isabash. I find the 35% reduction in Black American smoking. I believe Isabash finds a 35.7% reduction. I find a 12.5% reduction, 13% if we average it out, reduction in overall cigarette consumption. Levy et al. Finds I think a 15% reduction in cigarette smoking. So this sort of counterfactual model that I've developed allows me to find results that would be suggested by tobacco researchers, by people who have spent much more time in this field than I, a IO economist. But looking at this as well, looking at the market outcomes and the individual specific behavior, I find that about 68% of all menthol smokers switch. That reduces when we look at the Black American community. Only about half of Black American smokers actually are willing to switch over to menthol products, to non-menthol products, that is. And I find that there's a reduction in consumer surplus that is largest among the Black American community. Looking at changes in e-cigarette consumption, I find that there is an increase in e-cigarette consumption as a function of the menthol ban. That is largest if we consider the producers of cigarettes and e-cigarettes to be merged. That is, that it's one individual company rather than independent entities. While these numbers look large, e-cigarette consumption within the time span of my model was still quite low. So actually, my model suggests that less than 2% of cigarette menthol users actually quit and substitute to e-cigarettes. And that's actually, it turns out, quite similar to what was observed in Canada when Canada put into place their own menthol ban, that people might have said they'd be willing to consider e-cigarettes, but very few actually followed through on that. Finally, looking at cessation products, there's very little change in cessation product usage. And this is good. This is sort of my canary in the coal mine, the gold mine. If I saw a huge jump in cessation product usage, I would be concerned that my model will be misspecified. So that is the menthol cigarette ban. One additional benefit of having these large structural models is I can also look at how other possible counterfactuals of interest, and that is moving into a cigarette sales tax. What sales tax results in an equivalent reduction of overall smoking usage as that's seen under the menthol ban? And I find that $1.02 sales tax will reduce smoking consumption equivalently, with a smaller reduction in overall consumer surplus. But that is primarily because of the Black American community. If you remove the Black American community from the from this consideration, then you find that non-Black households prefer the ban rather than the tax policy. Now, I look at expected revenue from the ban. Now, this is very much a back of the envelope finding, since I don't account for how the tax itself could reduce an individual's consumption of cigarettes. And I find that there's an expected tax revenue of about 115-ish million a week. That's a lot of money. It's like 24.4 billion over the 4 years I consider in my sample. That is money that could be put towards advancing health equity programs in the United States. But again, I do want to say that this is likely on the higher end of the expectation, since I'm not accounting for that reduction in consumption that would happen as an individual continues to smoke. Looking at overall changes in consumption given tax rates, I would expect the actual value to be maybe 15 to 20% smaller than what I find. And finally, I find that there's a smaller increase in e-cigarette usage as compared to the menthol ban, as there are no longer individuals looking to use e-cigarettes in order to continue to use menthol products. And again, there's very little impact on cessation product usage. Finally, what if we expand the menthol ban to include flavored and menthol varieties of e-cigarettes? And I find that the reduction in cigarette consumption is near identical, and you have a 46% reduction in e-cigarette usage, but this varies strongly over time, as prior to 2018, e-cigarettes were not as popular as they were post 2018. So I would say that, and I have a graph in the model which shows the reduction in e-cigarette usage over time that shows that there is, that is highly time dependent. And again, little impact on cessation product usage. So that is my model. That is the results of my counterfactual analysis of sort of taking a traditional IO approach into looking at this tobacco policy research, where I combine household and retail data under a random coefficient nested logit framework. I allow for demographic interactions to capture individual specific and demographic specific consumption. I find that the menthol ban reduces cigarette smoking by about 36%. Among the Black American community, you have a 35% reduction in smoking, which is huge for proponents who want to advance health equity. I find that $1.02 sales tax reaches pretty much an equivalent reduction in cigarette smoking. You don't get that Black American reduction in smoking, so it doesn't come with that health equity outcome that the menthol ban has, but you do also generate a significant amount of money via tax revenue that could be put towards advancing health equity programs. Finally, I find an expansion of the ban to include menthol and flavored varieties of e-cigarettes results in a 46% reduction in e-cigarette usage. And that is it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. That's great. Dr. Whitaker, would you like to make any further comments?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the great presentation. I guess so one last question, I guess, regarding when you do like add in like the flavored e-cigarette ban, do you also see like how this would affect like menthol cigarettes, or I mean cigarette smoking usage when both are implemented? Because I would wonder if that would you might have a smaller coefficient when there's both of the bans implemented versus just the menthol cigarette ban.
So in my model counterfactuals, the expansion of I've never looked at just a e-cigarette flavored ban. Maybe that is something I should have considered. I've always considered just the ban expanding to include menthol and flavored varieties of e-cigarettes. I've never done the opposite. What would happen if we just banned e-cigarettes but left menthol cigarettes alone? That's interesting, and a possible extension of this work. But
Yeah.
at the time, that was not, the primary question I was focused on. To that end, though, I suspect, given that there's very little substitution from cigarettes to e-cigarettes, the reverse is likely true as well. That people who smoke e-cigarettes smoke them because they like e-cigarettes, and people who smoke cigarettes like them because they like cigarettes, and there's very little crossover.
Yeah, because I was just curious because like when we had essentially some of our work, we had done a mapping of different like e-cigarette and cigarette flavor restrictions. And so you had about like 1 in 10 people that lived in an area that had like an e-cigarette menthol restriction, but not a menthol cigarette restriction.
That's interesting.
So it could
Um,
create- that's one of those concerns, is we're worried about substitution from e-cigarettes to cigarettes when there was a restriction of e-cigarettes, but not the other. But yeah,
Hmm, I sort of found that, or my model results suggest that there was this growth of e-cigarette usage over time, and you did have this reduction in. I'm not going to say that there were not people switching from cigarettes to e-cigarettes. There certainly were quite a few people in my model, in the simulated model at least, who were originally cigarette smokers and then switched over to e-cigarettes as e-cigarette popularity grew. My results show that my counterfactual suggests that was very clear that happened. Just that removing particular products is not going to incentivize those consumers not to. Maybe if we've removed menthol and flavored e-cigarettes, the consumers wouldn't switch, but that the ban itself would not have incentivized people to change their behavior. That they would have changed their behavior regardless.
okay. Yeah. Well, thank you. I guess there's not much time left, so I'll let you get to the rest of the audience questions, so everyone can have their questions
Yeah,
answered.
I mean, so actually, you answered one of them with that question about an e-cigarette flavor ban. So that's helpful. Um, one comment just said, have you thought about state tax revenue? Um, I
I
think
haven't considered state tax revenue. That becomes a lot more difficult. So many of these DMAs, they say sometimes cross state boundaries by a county or two, just because they're trying to encompass localities that have similar consumers. So that would be difficult to do.
okay, yeah, there seems to be some demand for it in the chat. So, but just maybe for future work. One question that I had, I mean, so you have a supply side component of the model, which is I think also a differentiating factor from the literature, and is nice. But Newport cigarettes are made by RJ Reynolds, right? And so like this
Mhm.
like a menthol ban is going to dramatically affect one company more than another company.
Mm.
So have you thought about like the competitive effects of such a policy on the
That would be interesting. Maybe if I expanded this to include, say, not only independent producers of cigarettes and e-cigarettes, but independent producers of, um, the tobacco cigarettes and menthol cigarettes, that would have been quite interesting. The difficulty, and there is, if I wanted to, I could have not aggregate. I could have aggregated to, say, a smaller level where you have menthol products produced by certain manufacturers and cigarette products produced by certain manufacturers as independent. The difficulty with that is these IO models do not run fast. This thing takes 2 weeks or so to converge to the final solution, and that's with 6 products, and the time increases exponentially. If I had like a supercomputer, that would work, but I'm running it on my personal laptop, which makes things more difficult.
I completely understand, having done these models myself. So remind me though what you're doing with respect to withdrawal. So I mean the cessation here, what are the implications in the model from cessation?
So the model itself doesn't have withdrawal as a component. The addiction behavior that I included is myopic. You don't have rational addiction. People aren't considering how their consumption today will influence their consumption in the future. It simply is acting as if you did, simply looking back 1 week in the past and saying, if you consumed last week, um, how does that change the amount of happiness you consume this week? So withdrawals are actually being absorbed as a sort of increase in the desire to smoke this week. I did look at what would happen if I removed addiction as a component in my model, and then I evaluated consumer utility, and I found that addiction made up about, and this would be the withdrawals, made up about, and other things like habit formation, but made up about 2%, 2.5% of the overall loss in utility that consumers that there's just a preference for cigarettes among certain populations of consumers. Maybe they think makes them look cool. Maybe they think, they're trying to fit in with their peers. And the loss of
I mean,
that seems to hurt them
I,
more.
I would push back on that. I mean, I think there's something missing here, right? That like
Mm.
addiction is much more powerful than 2% of the variation in sales.
So
Physiologically, like what we know about addiction. So, I mean, I mean, I understand the limitations from a
yeah.
modeling perspective, but I
Mhm.
think like you kind of led with this, or one of the conclusions that you were talking about was that you did not expect to see cessation devices going up much.
Mhm.
And I would expect them to go up more, right? So like if
Mm.
I really like
Yeah.
menthols, that's a strong preference, but
Mhm.
turns out I'm actually addicted to nicotine as well.
Mhm.
And so when you get rid of my preferred brand, I'm in a really bad spot, you know.
The increase in cessation product usage is averaged over the entire time. So unfortunately, I've looked at what would happen if I remove the products and then looking at the change in consumption the next week, and you do find a spike in cessation product usage, but that reduces as people sort of wean off of them. The consumers, my model, wean off of them. The other issue, and I agree, this is, one of the, my state dependent behavior only looks at the prior week's consumption. That's really a limitation with these large demand models. The modeling approach I took makes the gradient of the objective function extremely difficult to calculate. Um, so I'm only capturing consumers who are the most addictive and the most extreme form of their addictive component. The other portion is being shoved into their preference distribution. Um, so there is, that issue as well, that the addictive component, if I, was able to expand that maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks would be, better to capture this purely addictive component. So I'm only capturing the most extreme consumers in my model.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, another thing you can sell to here is that, I mean, a lot of the empirical models of smoking are estimated with annual data, right?
Hmm.
That helps with the addiction aspect, but it's also not the relevant time frame in which people are making
Yeah.
choices smoking. So
Even,
there are pros and cons to your approach.
yes.
I think.
I looked at expanding this to like bi-weekly, looking at consumption bi-weekly, but the issue with that is then in the household level data, you can have people go nearly a month without purchasing, a month between purchases, um, and be considered continuous smokers, which doesn't make, I don't think those people are comparable to people who smoke every week. Even with weekly consumption, if they purchase a product on a Monday and then wait till the next week's Sunday to purchase, that's, continuous consumption, my model. Um, so I think there's issues, especially as you expand this time frame when you start to capture. It becomes difficult to say, is this purely physiological addiction or is this just preference for the products? It's sort of like, mixed in there. It's
It's also
muggy.
it's also kind of glossing over the kind of pack purchasers versus carton purchasers versus
Hmm.
stockpiling that people are talking about.
Yeah,
So it's hard to disentangle those things.
absolutely.
Okay, well, I think we're 1 minute away, so I'll kick it back to Sam to take us out. But just a reminder that we have top of the tops right after if you'd like to discuss these issues more. And the link is in the chat, so immediately following our webinar, you can click there. So thanks.
Okay, yeah, so that is the end of our time for today. Again, like Michael's has said, if you have any extra burning questions or thoughts for Dr. Reinhardt, you can join us for Top of the Tops, an interactive group discussion. To join, please copy the Zoom meeting room URL that's posted in the chat and switch rooms with us once this event concludes. We're going to leave the webinar room open for an extra minute after the end to give everyone a chance to copy the URL, which is bit.ly/tops meeting. That is bit.ly/tops meeting, all lowercase. Thank you to our presenter, moderator, and discussant. And finally, thank you to the audience of 180 people for your participation today. Have a tops notch weekend.
Thank you.